Thanks for accommodating my Midwest Minnesota hours. I know we're probably missing some people because you accommodated me by starting an hour earlier. I appreciate it. So we're not here till 11 p.m., but I can make it till 10 p.m., I think, painting and talking. So again, I just taught a workshop with everyone, and I'm going to go to my screen here. My workshop basically kind of focused on using this value study method to find big shapes to paint in order to loosen up. Again, most people, when they take a workshop, they want to loosen up a little bit. And it's, if you want that to be, your style of painting, so important to find big shapes that you can paint with big brushes and big puddles and find those all important lost edges that are so beautiful in watercolor. And it's a lot more difficult than you would think, though, because our brains aren't really wired to see one big connecting shape. When we look at a scene, we see all the little smaller individual things, each individual building, the cars, the people, all the stuff that's happening. But it's so vital that you see through all those little dark details to that big underlying shape underneath. So what I do on my value studies, and this is just an example of a type of a lesson that I do in my workshops where we all work from the same reference photograph, or if it's a plein air workshop, from the same scene. And we just draw it twice and we kind of work our way through going back and forth between the value study and the color painting. But obviously this value study is finished with the darks now, but underneath all those dark shapes that I put on there was one big unifying connected middle value shape. And then I try and find that same shape on my color painting after I've toned my paper with a light wash. So when I do my value studies, I skip the light wash. I just let the white paper represent that first initial wet light wash that I'd be doing in color. So again, I just skip that step on the value study and go right to step 2, which is the middle values. And the middle values is that stage of the painting. Typically, I firmly believe is the most difficult stage of the painting, because that's the first time that now you're painting objects in your scene. And that's where your brain goes back into separation mode and doesn't see the connections. It wants to see all these separate individual things in your painting. So I try and work as best as I can by squinting at the scene, leaving anything that looks light when I squint at it, white paper. Everything else I try and join together in one big middle value shape. And then I use that initial stage of my value study, which I'll be doing tonight here, to do my first 2 very large washes on my color painting. So I don't really finish the value study before I go to my color one. I get that big middle value shape on, and then I shift gears over to my actual color painting. So I'll demonstrate that technique here this evening for you. This is the scene. Now I sent you a reference photograph that I was going to use, but I zoomed in a little bit, cropped it. I don't really do a lot of Photoshop work before I do a painting off of a reference photograph. Sometimes it's just, moving a figure around a little bit or two. This was an instance where I really kind of played around with moving the figures around in the scene and trying to get a better composition so that they were a little bit more spread out. And just kind of made sense for leading the eye around and through the painting. So this is going to be a little bit different than the reference photograph that I sent out to you all, but that's important too. Okay. It's not always that reference photograph is ready, cut and dried, ready to paint. There's a lot of times when you have to make some minor adjustments or modifications to come up with a better solution for the painting. And sometimes if it's just minor things, I'll just go ahead and fix it on the value study and change those things and see how it works when I'm painting it in black and white. But in this instance, like I said, I really felt there was too much information. I wanted to zoom in on the figures a little bit, simplify things, especially for a demonstration when I have like an hour and a half to do a painting. I don't want to tackle too much here. But I think in this instance, we've got everything we need. We've got the beach, we've got the rocks, we've got the figures in here, some beautiful colors and shapes. So when I'm squinting at this now, I'm trying to plan out for my value study, and on my value studies, I usually just use these 9x12 blocks of Kilimanjaro paper from Cheap Joe's. They're perfect for value studies, really good watercolor paper, 100% cotton, cold press. So I'm still getting good results with my brush. and they're always on sale. So I can buy 10 of them at a time and use them for all my value studies. But even if I'm going to do a half sheet painting, I just still do like a 9 by 12 value study. I keep them pretty small and simplified. But what I'm going to do now is just kind of squint down at this scene, and in my mind's eye, I'm going to try and work through the couple of first big stages, and it's all based on value. There's a lighter shape and darker shapes around it. How am I going to show? So there's some obvious light shapes, right? The foam of the ocean, that's going to be light. We've got the breaking surf at the beach. That's going to be light. These bleached out rocks and sand are very bright. Those are going to be lights. But we also have very subtle, darker areas, this wet sand at the edge of the beach. Okay. Do I want to keep that in light or middle value? So and now's the time to kind of play around with things and ask myself, is it better to incorporate that into lights or mids? If I don't put this in middle value, I'm not going to be able to show the highlights on this girl down here. Okay. She's got some really nice sunlight on her leg, on her swimsuit, on her shoulder, and that's going to be showed off because of the darker wet sand around her. Okay. So I want to make sure that my sand is in middle value in my value study. Now, when I'm doing my value study, and again, you'll see this when I demonstrate it, I just work with one big puddle of like value 6 or something, Payne's gray. So all my middle values are the same value. I'm working them all up the same puddle. But when I do it on my color painting, I can make the water more of like a value 7. I can make this wet sand more of like a value 4 or 5. Okay, so I can adjust that range of middle values I'm working with. They're not all going to be the same middle value. But I'm already in my mind's eye, I'm trying to work through the steps of how I'm going to approach this and use those values to to get the best possible results to show these forms. Same thing with the boys up here. Now, this is something I didn't do in Photoshop, but he's got some nice light on his feet and his back, just like the girl here, but he's around all that light sand. So this wet sand is coming up close to the boy. I'm just going to take some artistic license when I do this and go ahead and bring that a little bit further up on the beach so I can use that middle value of the wet sand to show the light on his back and on the back of his swimsuit. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, when I squint at this, all the areas I'm going to leave white on my value study are going to be the foam and the water here and here, the light parts of the rock here, a lot of the light bleached out sand here, and the sunlit sides of the figures. So this figure is not going to be all light. She's got a much darker shadow side that I'm going to incorporate in when I paint the water and things. I'm going to paint right into the shadow side of that figure, just leaving the light side around her. Same thing with this girl. When I paint this wet sand, I'm not going to paint around all of the girl. I'm going to paint right through that leg. That's going to be darker later. I'm going to paint right through her head. That's going to be darker later. Okay, so all those darker shapes are going to be incorporated in that middle value shape. So probably best to just paint and show you instead of talking way through it. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say, and it's very true. So once I demonstrate this, hopefully it'll be clear in your mind's eye of what I'm trying to accomplish. And as best as I can, I'm going to try and connect as much of those middle values as I possibly can. It's not always feasible to connect all of them, but if I can connect the shadow side of these rocks in with this turquoise water, and then into this cobalt blue water, and then into the burnt sienna of the figure, and then into this violety color of the sand, and up into these gray rocks, I'm going to get all these nice lost edges and color transitions that are really taking advantage of what makes watercolor such a beautiful medium to work with. And that's my main goal. Simplify for the purposes of having a nice, bold, loose painting, and really finding those lost edges to take advantage of what makes watercolor so beautiful. So I'm going to use a fairly large brush here, like a size 14 or 16 sable brush. And I'm mixing, this is just Payne's gray for my value study. And again, I'm going to try and mix it to like a value 5 or 6. It's very fluid. I have a lot of water in here, but it's got enough value that's going to jump off the white of the paper and really be distinct on how I'm going to start carving out my shapes here. Okay, that should be enough to get through my little 9 by 12 value study. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and it doesn't matter where I start. Really, I just want to start at the edge of my paper somewhere. I can work top to bottom, left to right, right bottom corner to the upper, whatever it is. But I'm going to go ahead because the biggest part of that middle value shape is probably the water. And I just mixed that puddle and my brush is all loaded up. So I'm going to start over here with this. And I'll try and point at this as I go and talk my way through what I'm doing here for you. Okay, so again, the water down here, and I'll just try and create that edge of the breaking wave there. And it's going to connect right up to those rocks over here. The rocks are going to have some middle value and dark later. All right, into the water here, I'm going to try and leave a couple little tendrils of light water if I can. Down there, I can leave a little bit of a highlight on an area of the rock if I want to up here. This is going to connect up onto the top here, some of that blue water up above, and that's going to go right into my rocks at the top of it there. It's not quite bleached out just yet. Reload my brush. Come down here. Now I'm in this area. I'm going to start connecting that shadow side of the rocks in here. Now I'll start leaving a couple little highlights along the bottom edge of those rocks, some of those lighter shapes here. But I'm going to try and connect that front plane of the rocks coming down. That's more of a middle value. Again, just some smaller little rocks up here that I'll try and paint around. Some little highlights. We've got more water down here. Connecting, reload my brush again. Okay, look at that nice. I'm sorry?
I know somebody's dying to ask this. Are you working at an angle?
No, not really. My paper's pretty flat. It's my table's sloped just a little bit, so you can see that bead of paint and
Yeah.
water is kind of collecting at the bottom, but it's not drastic. Everything's not going to be running all the way down to the bottom of my paper, which I don't like. So it's tilted maybe like 5 degrees. That's about it. Nothing
This
drastic.
is this is typically how you work.
Yes. Okay, so now my water is going to start coming up here. And again, we've got a little figure up here along the shore. We've got the deeper water coming in here. We've got another that's connecting to another rock right here. Got some more middle values there. Kind of working its way up along the shoreline. Okay, now I've got the shadow side of that figure is going to be incorporated into this. Back of her legs, but that water in the front of her is going to paint around that and create the highlight on her arm on the front of her. All right, got more breaking surf down here. Got that nice big bead of water and paint collected on here that I can use to get a nice big connected shape. Okay, now I want to start making sure that that water is kind of breaking up towards the figure here. She's got a little cast shadow out onto the beach. More blue water here, negatively painting around that surf. Okay, now I'm coming over to this area. It's going to connect to the shadow side of that figure. I'm just going to paint connect the shadow side of that figure and leave the highlights on the left side of that figure, facing the sun behind. So that the figures are, that's a very important part of this, is making sure your animals or your people or your cars or whatever it might be, some of those more detailed shapes aren't separated out and painted around as white spaces that you're going to come back in and fill in later. It's just another part of the painting that I'm going to try and incorporate. I'll get back to that wet sand soon. Okay, so I'm going to still painting around this figure. There's their side, that one leg, the left leg, the other leg coming down here is a bit of a shadow on it. Down here again, kind of connecting to that surf. Start breaking this up a little bit to show those waves coming through at the bottom. Okay, now I'm into the wet sand that I was talking about before. And again, this is probably a little darker than it's going to be on my actual color painting. But so be it. It's all part of that one big puddle that I've got here. So I'm painting the wet sand now. And I'm going to paint through that little girl's head because it's darker. Coming up here, painting this wet sand area up above. Keep connecting that as best as I can up to some of these rocks up here. Let that sand start coming down here. And again, I want that to probably come up to the back of that boy, just extend it a little bit further. So it's helping me out to show the highlight on the back of him. So I didn't have to extend it too far out to take some of that artistic license. Okay, she's got the little bucket in her hand. That's got a little highlight on it. I'm going to paint around her left edge, her shoulder, the back of her swim trunk, the back of that leg coming down. But the front of her is in shadow. The top, that other leg is mostly in shadow that I can paint through. Just right down by her foot has a little bit of a highlight on it. Okay, wet sand down here. More wet sand and rocks. And maybe one more time, taking some artistic license. I'm going to move these little darker rocks a little closer to the water instead of having them off separated. Just go ahead and have that be part of this shape now too. And some little shadows in the sand coming down. Some of these other darker wet rocks coming up. Last thing I need to do is start incorporating the shadow side of these little boys playing in the sand. That left arm is in there. His head is darker, a little bit of a cast shadow going and connecting to this boy. Connections, connections, connections. That's what I'm always trying to find. And again, because of our brain's tendency to not find connections, but notice the separations, it's a little bit more difficult than you would think trying to do this, but so important for painting a nice, big, loose painting. Okay, so that's a pretty big connected shape now on here. Again, very straightforward and graphic, and probably not going to be as dark on the water down here. But now the point of this, again, is to find those great color transitions when I do this in color. There's some really strong, beautiful colors in this painting that I want to just kind of mix and merge on my paper. And so I'm going to try and kind of work from a lost edge in a lot of areas and as best as I can, let some of these colors lose their edges on my color painting. Okay, so I've got that on here. Get some of that extra off there. So now I'm going to go ahead and I've started to sketch out a little bit for my color painting. And I'll tighten up my drawing now so you can see me a little, do some of the drawing on here. So I've got two important references with the value study and the actual reference photograph.
Andy, I don't want to interrupt right now, but I just want to tell the audience that if they have any questions, to put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
And and go ahead and read them at any time. I'm
Okay.
fine painting and talking, so you're not disturbing me. That's what they're here for, to learn. Okay, so I'm just going to very loosely kind of give myself a line for that, where that water is going to be. Here's the big rocks. And I'm going to go ahead and, for the shape is going to be quite dark later, I'm going to go pretty heavy on my pencil drawing. I don't want to lose my pencil drawing when I start putting paint on here. So some of these colors are going to be, like I said, have quite a bit of value on it. So I can go ahead and really darken up some of this. Make sure my pencil drawing is going to be there for me when I need it. All right, here's the rocks. I'm just going to give myself a little bit of that shadow shape here, the edge of it, so I know where I'm going to be connecting there. Here's this rock down here on the shore, that brighter edge of it, a big dark shadow area. That rock coming down, go nice and dark on that shadow side. Okay, here we go. And that's going to connect right over. Now the edge of that rock here, the bottom of that rock is going to come over and it just joined. That kind of tells me about where that lady is. It kind of comes right up to her shoulder. So that's going to help me make sure that she is to scale when I draw her. So I try and like leave my pencil on the paper a lot of times when I'm doing my actual drawing, kind of a contour drawing, making sure that all my shapes are lining up and fitting appropriately on the page. I don't want to overdraw. That's another reason for doing kind of a contour drawing. It just kind of keeps me focused on the edges of some of these shapes and not worried too much about drawing all the little details. There's a lot of things in here I can just paint. I don't need to draw it ahead of time. Rocks, whatever. Shadow shapes, those things I can just paint again, not a big deal. Okay, here's the edge of the water down here. Just very lightly give myself a little bit of a guideline for that surf. But again, that's nothing that, it's not as important as a figure where people are going to notice if it's out of proportion or way out of scale. No one knows where that wave was. I can just paint it, and where my brush ends up, that's where it is. It doesn't matter. All right, so now we've got another figure here, darkening up her shape. Trying to keep it nice and simple if I can. And she's got that bend in her leg this way. It's a little bit lower. She's got that little bit of a cast shadow going out onto the water. Okay, she's in there. A little bit darker on the edge of the water there. That surf, that wave is going to come up and hit that girl right about at her hip level. So I know where she fits. And I had that little light pencil sketch that I did ahead of time, that just to kind of help me make sure everything was placed properly on my paper. That's important. Now, when I'm doing my darker drawing, I don't have to worry about things being way out of whack. I'm pretty confident when I put these shapes in that they're where they need to be. I'm not going to have to do a lot of erasing or anything. So, okay, there's her foot. And then we've got some more rocks down here underneath her. I'm going to probably connect them to these other rocks eventually. Just going to take some artistic license and move those down and over. Last thing I need to do, so I'm going to go from her feet over kind of at a slight angle, and that's where these kids are. Make sure that they're sort of to scale also. Back of his shorts. Front of his shorts are going to be quite a bit darker in the shadow, so I can darken that up quite a bit. Arch of his back. Going down. Zoom in a little bit for you while I'm doing these figures here. His head in, shoulders, arm going down. The back arm is darker in shadow. Front arm's coming out like so. Connecting right to the shadow of this kid's arm, his shoulder. His head's gonna be a little bit higher up above the other one. His arched back. Almost connecting to his knees, pretty close anyways. His swim trunks. Tried to come up with a California scene for y'all. I could have painted cows and snow, but would have bored you all to death.
We like cows.
Okay, so there's my my sketch. And there's a lot of things I can just paint in here, a lot of the small rocks. I don't have to draw every rock. For the most part, I don't draw shadows. Just making sure I can just put them in with my brush. Again, just a couple of vague lines for the crashing wave, but that doesn't really matter either. It can just end up where it ends up. So I've got enough information here now that I can really paint my big shapes, and I'm confident about where things are supposed to be, but it's not covered with a really elaborate drawing that will inhibit my chances of kind of loosening up and painting quickly with a big brush. So I'm going to take a kneaded eraser, and I'm going to go over this and get rid of some of that extra graphite. A lot of those initial little squiggly lines that I put on here to block things in. Don't need all those pencil marks. I just use a #2 pencil, so sometimes it leaves a little bit too much graphite on my paper. So I want to get some of that off before I wet my paper. I'm not dragging graphite all over the place, and I can get some nice clean color in areas here. But I drew dark enough that even after going over this with a kneaded eraser, I can still see my pencil drawing very clearly. Mm-hmm. And that'll be there through my first couple of washes. So I'm confident in where I'm going to be painting. All right. So
I have a question from the audience.
Sure.
They want to know if you include the darkest darks on the value study before you do the drawing.
Nope. So because this shape is so difficult, this is the most difficult shape to paint, that middle value shape. And again, when I start the difference between that And I have got another little example here that I used in my workshop. On the point of what happens when you finish a value study. Ah, shoot, what did I do with that thing? Might be over here somewhere. But when you finish your value study, you've got with all the darks, you're starting to put all the detail in again, and it's sometimes it's hard to see that underlying middle value shape that you struggled so hard to find. Okay, so now I used to finish my value study completely with the darks and then go to my color painting, but now I think it's much more beneficial to find this shape before I finish it off with my darks, and because that's the shape I really want to copy on my color version after I put my light wash on. I want to go from the beautiful browns of the rocks right into the turquoise water here, into the blue green, into the violet of the sand, into some of the burnt sienna and colors of the swimsuits of the figures, into these kind of blue-gray rocks, okay? So I want to get those lost edges and color transitions. It's going to be much easier if I don't finish off my value study with all the details first.
Okay, thank you. And then there's another question. Do you do an initial drawing on a different piece of paper and then transfer it to your watercolor paper?
I just draw freehand.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I've been, as you said in your introduction, I've been drawing since I was like 3 years old, I think. And I'm comfortable drawing. So do what you need to do. If you need to trace it to save time or whatever, that's fine. But again, I'm not always working the same size as the photo or the value study. I would do the same small value study if I was doing a half sheet watercolor. So, all righty. So even though I'm not painting the middle value shape yet, this value study is still going to inform a lot of my decisions on my initial light wash on my color version. Okay, because I'm going to look at these big white spaces that I left in my value study and then my photo and say what needs to be there later. When I paint around these shapes and leave the lighter area behind, I might actually want white paper here. I might want some white paper up here. Up here, I need the color of the rock. Down here, I need the color of the beach. In some of these smaller areas, I need the warm colors of the figures. Okay, so in my first light wash, I'm just going to wet my paper and drop those colors in. I'm not really painting any things other than defining some of the foam along the edge of the water because I won't wet into that area. But that stage of the painting, my light wash, is just all about getting rid of the white of the paper. So I'm working on 140-pound Saunders rough paper, and I just do it loose. I don't staple it or tape it down to the table or anything. But because I wet both sides of my paper, and that'll help keep it flat. And it's also going to stay damp just a little longer so I can get through that whole first wash and be confident I'm not going to start getting dry edges and hard edge marks before I have a chance to finish my light wash here. So I'm taking a natural sponge. I'm going to wet the whole back of this quarter sheet. It's just 11 by 15 quarter sheet, so a little bit bigger than the value study. Not much. Quarter sheet's still kind of my comfort zone. I think probably 80% of my paintings are quarter sheet. Close to 20% are half sheet, and every once in a while, I'm feeling up to it, I'll do a full sheet. Okay, so I've got it soaking wet, and you can see on the front shot here now, it's already curling, okay, because the back of the paper is expanding. It's all curled up. That's another reason why you want to wet both sides, okay? I'm not just going to wet the front or it'd be the opposite. So I wet the back, then I'm going to actually kind of squeeze my sponge out and go over it again. So now I'm pulling a little bit of that water back off with a thirsty sponge. Now I'll flip it over. I'm going to wet the front, and when I wet the front, I'm just going to avoid some of the areas that I want to stay white paper around the foam of the seawater, okay? Otherwise, everything else can have a tone on it. This area up here is all the rocks. There's no white up there. I can cover all of that. The beach, there's no white. I can cover all of that. Might want to leave a little bit of a highlight, shimmering highlight on that guy, on the back of his swim trunks maybe. But all this beach is covered. Here's some more foam. The water, I don't want to go into there. This girl doesn't have really any white on her. I can cover through her for the most part. So I'm just trying to avoid the breaking surf. When I wet this up here, I can throw a little bit of water up at the top because I don't want all of it just white. Very subtle blues up there. For the most part, this is going to have tone on it. She doesn't have any white on her. I can wet right through the figure there, back down to where there's some surf crashing. I'm going to avoid that little area. And again, now my paper is starting to sit down a little bit better because I've got some moisture on the front of it as well. This is a little bit of an anomaly in the fact that I'm leaving. Normally I have hardly any white that I have to worry about wetting around. But in this case, with all the surf, I need to be a little bit careful. All right, so now same thing. I'm going to kind of squeeze out that sponge. Now it's kind of a thirsty sponge, and I'm going to go over it again and pull a little bit of that water off and just make sure it's still damp, but not soaking wet. That's why I use a sponge to wet my paper. If you use a brush, you don't have the chance to really kind of squeeze it out like you do with a sponge. And a lot of times when people are using a brush to wet their paper, they're putting way too much water on their paper, and it takes forever to dry and get to the next stage. So I want to be able to get to my middle values before you're all sleeping on me. So
Yeah, I think that sponge trick is really important. I think even after the workshop, and I went back and did one of your paintings, I wet the paper with a typical brush, and it was just way too much water. Yours isn't
yeah.
dripping wet; it's just damp, like you said.
Yep. And I get that question a lot from my students. They're always asking me, my first wash is so wet and I have to wait forever to get to my middle value. And I'm like, how are you wetting your paper? With a brush or a sponge? And most often it's a brush. And they're wetting it with a big mop, and it takes forever to dry. They're putting way too much water on it. You don't need that much. It just needs to be damp. I don't want hard edges on this first wash. And my paper is plenty damp to get through this. I might have to use a hairdryer before I go to the next stage on it. Okay, so like I said, I talked my way through it before. I'm going to start with the beach. I usually start my light wash with kind of the lightest, warmest color. So even when I'm doing a landscape, I get asked that a lot too. Why didn't you start with the sky when you were doing your light wash? Sometimes I will if I'm really worried about the cloud formations and losing the moisture on the paper before I get to the clouds. But more often than not, I usually like to typically start with the lightest, warmer area. In this case, that's going to be that beach. So another mistake a lot of people make when they're painting sand is they make it too warm. It's too yellow or burnt sienna and yellow ochre. Sand, especially near the water where it cools off a lot, but even in general, all the sand, it's a little cooler than most people think, okay? So I'm going to start off by mixing some raw sienna and burnt sienna, but I'm going to put a little lavender in it and maybe even some cobalt blue to just kind of take the edge off a little bit and cool it down. And it's going to be a much more convincing color of sand than if you get too yellow with it. So this is raw sienna, burnt sienna. But now I'm going to put some lavender in here. Like I said, and even a little cobalt blue to kind of take the edge off just a little bit, maybe some neutral tint. And it'll be plenty warm enough to look like sand, but it's not going to be yellow. That's the key. And I have to put this on a little darker than I want it to end up, okay? I can't put it on so it looks just like this because this has got a lot of drying to do. It's going to fade at least a value, more than likely 2 values by the time it's all said and done. So I've got to get, that's another thing that kind of is a bit of a struggle for students sometimes to get the hang of it. They think they're putting their first light wash on way too dark. And I tell them, if it looks right now, it's wrong, okay? Because your paper is all wet. You've got a lot of moisture in your puddle. You're putting it on there. When that dries a half an hour from now, it's not going to look anything close to that. So you've got to get comfortable pushing the values of that first light wash. Okay, so I'm going to paint right in and around my boys here. I'll come back in and throw some burnt sienna on them in a bit. I'm trying to get the big shapes in here first. I can paint right through that little guy's head for now. I want to paint around the back of this guy because I wanted to leave a little bit of a highlight on his swimsuit and his back. So just a little bit there. All right. Gonna add a little bit more warmth as it comes down there. So it's kind of stands out from the violety water once I get to that. Okay, so a lot of this is filled in now on that light wash. All I'm doing is getting rid of the white of the paper. This initial wash. I'm going to warm it up some up here now on the rocks. There's more yellow and brown up there. It's not the sand, it's the rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and throw some more raw sienna and burnt sienna in this. And maybe a little more neutral tint again. When I get up here, it's just to kind of help make that little bit of a difference between the rocks and the sand. Those warmer areas I'll be leaving behind. It's quite yellow actually down here. And some of those rocks really warms up down here. I paint around those areas. Want to make sure I have that color that I need. Same thing over on the edge here. And down on here, on the edge of this rock. All right. So I've got a lot of this area filled in. I'm going to go back to that more of a bleached out version that I had in the sand and just kind of tone down a little bit of the rocks in a couple areas so they're not all quite so warm. That little area there, get a little bit of a different color. Again, all this is for is just getting that local color on the paper, setting the stage for step 2. And when I'm painting around these areas, what's going to be left behind? That's all I'm looking for. But I'm going to go ahead and kind of start adding some a little bit more violet to this wash, even if I'm going to be darkening it up some later at the edge of that wet beach there. And just kind of start setting the stage for that by going a little bit more purple with my color. I'm going to start getting some of those little tendrils in here. I can use some gouache and things later to get a bit more of the foam on the edge there. That's fine. I'm going to paint right up to this girl, the back of her leg there. Again, this is going to be a little bit darker. I do my middle value wash, but I want it to be all connected right now. Paint around that nice sharp edge of the breaking foam down here. A rolling wave coming over up towards this figure. My paper is still a little damp. I don't have to worry about it, but it's not sopping wet. Everything isn't flooding all over the place. Again, that's I don't want that to happen right now. I don't need that. Start getting a little bit more of that breaking surf in here. Okay, so pretty soon I'm going to need to start getting the burnt sienna on my figures. Make sure that they're reading well and connected in here. Most of this is going to be just middle value later, so I might kind of avoid that area for now. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. A little thicker paint. And get some nice warmth on my figures. Some burnt sienna, some cadmium red. They're out on the beach. Got a lot of nice warmth to them. If they fuzz a little bit, all the better. I want this stage of the painting, I want things to fuzz a little bit. I zoom in again while I'm putting some tone on my figures so you can see a little better what's happening. Okay, so I'm just going to throw some burnt sienna down here where they are. Again, I wanted a little bit of a highlight, some really glare on that kid's back. And this is where his legs are going to be later. Just throwing some nice strong color in here. Same thing for this boy, where his legs are. This little girl has nice warmth on her shoulders. Drop that in. Don't have to worry about the other hand there. I'm going to want to get some color on her swimsuit pretty soon if I can. So she's got some skin tone on her. Same thing, this figure up here. Some nice warmth on her. Where her arm is going to be, where her leg is, and her feet. Same thing for this figure. Get some warmth on her. So that later when I paint those, that nice rich middle valued blue and paint around her, she's got the suntan going. Got some nice tone on that figure. All right. Back to some of those rocks, and then pretty soon I'm going to start working up in this corner, and I'll start introducing the foam and things, and trying to work into that water because I left this area open from another wash, so I think I can just kind of keep moving here for you. Not getting into too much trouble. Still trying to get some of that warmth of the bottom of the rocks down in this area though. If I leave any highlights on there, I don't want white paper. I want this kind of yellow version of the rock. That's why I'm putting that in here for now. And it can come down in the water a little bit, okay? They're all reflecting down in here, so it's okay if some of these colors fuzz a little bit. That's the whole point of wetting your paper a bit ahead of time so that you're not having things cut out and dry. All right, so that, whoops, I gotta zoom out a little bit again, sorry. So that's filled in with the rock color. This is all filled in with that cool beach color. The little touches of burnt sienna on my figures are filled in. That's filled in. That's left white, the breaking of the foam. A lot of that is going to be white, but I'm going to start breaking in as I start painting that water. I'm going to start, incorporating some of those little tendrils up there for the foam up there. But that's pretty much for now left white paper. So I'm going to go ahead and put a couple little nice, strong little touches of color on swimsuits and things now while I'm waiting for that to dry just a little bit more up on the water. So that little girl has a nice kind of bright orange swim bottom. Just using cadmium red and cadmium yellow. Give her a nice bit of orange there. A little stronger red in the shadow area. And I talked about this in my workshop too. And one of my pet peeves is when people are painting, putting figures in their paintings and they look like mannequins. They have no life to them. There's no lost edges. This little girl, yes, the camera froze her in that position, but she was running up the beach. Okay. It's okay if she's a little blurry and out of focus. That helps to imply some of that motion. These little boys aren't moving as fast. She's just standing there. Okay. But if this girl blurs a little bit into her surroundings, that's great. That helps to kind of, like I said, give that illusion of some movement and motion. She's got some cerulean blue on her swim top. Put a little bit of that in here too. Let that fuzz. Okay, and again, I'm gonna have to be darkening some of that wet sand behind her in a bit anyway, so that's okay. Anybody else need some? Probably that kneeling boy has a little blue in his swim trunks. I want to get some of that on there too. It's a little bit more white on the back end of it, but towards the sun. Otherwise, just getting some little small. So big to small. I worried about the big things first, and now I'm going in and touching in some of the small things with the figures. All righty. This can kind of start joining down in here too. Okay. So I think I'm going to go ahead and start with the water now. And I can't really do too much on the rocks. Actually, give me just a second. I'm going to hit this with a hairdryer real quick because as I'm coming in, I'm going to want to paint around the figures and start incorporating in the rocks. So I want to make sure this has got a chance to dry just a little bit. So bear with me for a minute. Oops. Okay. Normally, I don't really use a hair dryer much. I prefer to just let things dry naturally, but again, to speed things up for the demo and not just sit here and twiddle my thumbs for 20 minutes, go ahead and speed things up by hitting it with a hair dryer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start my big connected middle value shape now. And just like I did on here, I'm going to start with the water, all right? That big deep cobalt blue, kind of getting into some greens in the water, a little bit more turquoise here, breaking up this little corner some, so it's not just plain white, and then going right from that into the deeper violet of the water and the shadow side of the rocks. And just try and get some pleasant soft edges, lost edges, connections, simplify this scene down. There's a lot of little details I haven't done yet. All the little darks, the edges of the rocks, the swimsuits, the darks on the figures, darkening up the edges of some of these rocks. They're going to add a lot at the end of the painting, but that's for later. Right now, I want to paint big things. All right. I'm going to pull out a pretty good sized brush or two here. And I'm going to start with some cobalt blue, cerulean blue, cobalt turquoise, even some lavender on the edge of that. Can throw some permanent rose in there and get some more violety color. Just really get a big, beautiful puddle of color on my palette for that water. Make sure it's not too boring and flat. Get a little bit greener as it comes over in this area. Add some quinacridone gold or something to this when it starts getting even more turquoisey. Get some green. Okay, so I've got my palette all ready to go. That's a big shape that I need to paint coming up here. So I don't want to start with a little bit of paint on my palette and a small brush. I've got a pretty good sized brush. A nice big John Pike mixing area is covered with some beautiful color on it. So I should be able to kind of dive in and get most of that water painted off of this. All right, I'm going to start just like I did on my value study with the blue over here. If I keep reloading my brush and try and get that nice big bead of paint and water left behind, that way I should be able to keep connecting shapes, shifting colors on my brush. Throw some green in here once in a while. Already, as it starts getting closer to shore, it gets a little bit more green. Try and leave some of those whites behind like I did. And again, I can always come in with some gouache if I miss a couple little white areas and get that back. I have no qualms about using gouache whatsoever. If I need to, I use it. There's even some kind of ultramarine blue in areas. It's nice and deep there. And much like my first initial light wash, this is going to fade too. So I'm kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit when I put this on here.
So I have another question for you, and
Yep.
someone wants to know why you didn't tone the water area like you did the rest of because it's darker, right?
Yeah, because it was going to be kind of a one shot go and there wasn't a lot of light showing through underneath it, like a light side, shadow side. Most of the water was just going to be middle value. So I didn't even bother with it. That's a good question. Most of the time I do kind of include everything in my initial light wash, but in this instant, there wasn't much over here that was going to be light left behind it. And I wanted that nice crisp edge of the foam too. So I was kind of leery about toning it, anything.
Okay,
That's,
thanks.
yep. Okay, I'm going to get into some of the browns right away too. When I hit those rocks, I want to start incorporating the shadow sides of the rocks up in here. Just like I did on the value study, start giving them some form. Again, that's the whole point of this. Let the rocks kind of merge with the water. Leave that nice crisp edge of where the light was there. Trying to keep it big still for now. Want to get too small and fussy, but I do want to kind of get some nice dry brush on the edge of those rocks there. Those are different kinds of shapes than the water. All right, so I've got the rocks, the brown of the rocks is bleeding into the blue, cobalt blue, green, ultramarine blue. Okay, we've got some nice lost edges happening already up here, which is what I wanted. Rinse that brown off, go back to my blue.
Quick question, are you painting on rough or cold press?
This is actually rough for Saunders, but Saunders rough
Okay.
probably doesn't have as much texture as some papers are cold press. Saunders is a lot softer paper, so I use the rough Saunders, but it's still got a nice kind of a soft texture to it. Okay, so I'm just kind of getting the edge of the water up there. Same thing I painted before. And that's going to start coming down here and connecting into these other rocks down here. That little area is filled in with blue. Okay. Don't want to lose my bead there. I'm going to go back into some greens and start connecting this water across here. It's important to stay focused on the big and don't start worrying about don't get caught up here painting little things and lose a big bead and a giant shape. That's going to be a lot more obvious later if you have a hard edge or a big bloom or something there because you left it behind. So like I'll kind of veer away from some of those smaller areas and make sure that I'm staying focused on the big connection. Back into some of these rocks again over here, leaving a couple little highlights behind. Trying to keep it nice and graphically simple for now. A lot of little details still to come later. Plenty of time to sweat the small stuff. I don't want to sweat the small stuff just yet. All right, touch the water here and start connecting these rocks up in. There we go. It's got a little bit more of a middle value on the edge of those rocks up here. Just like I did up here. It's a little bit brighter here and more of a middle value on this edge of the rocks. I want to make sure I'm getting some of that connected in like so. Show the bleached out areas a little bit better. A little more neutral tint. I need to dull that down a bit. I want to make it too colorful. I am Andy after all. I've learned the power of neutrals that's one of the biggest differences in my work, I think, from how I painted 10, 15 years ago to how I paint now. I didn't understand the power of having some neutrals. I was seduced by color and I had strong color all over my paintings. And I don't like to get too gray with things. I like color, but it's important to just kind of take the edge off of some of the colors. And some of that happens naturally, when you're connecting shapes like I am here, the colors are going to kind of mix and merge on the paper and they're going to neutralize themselves. But yeah, I don't like to have really strong color everywhere, depending on the scene, of course. Keep working my way down to this gal. I wanted to give her just a little bit more time to dry so that water didn't creep into her skin tone. I have to paint around her, but I think I'm okay now.
So Andy, somebody just asked, is your paper bone dry at this point or
it's pretty close to, yeah, it's not quite bone dry, but it's getting there. I mean, I hit it with the hair dryer, so
okay.
I dried it quite a bit. I'm working up to this lady on the side here, painting around the front end of her. Back down to the big part of the water. Make sure I'm getting those good transitions between a little bit more blue, a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, a little bit of green. Just keep changing what's on my brush once in a while. Okay, now I need to be careful. I'm going to be painting around the light side of this figure, showing some of the foam, breaking foam on the coming up to the water's edge here, making sure a little bit of that is working its way through. Pretty quick here, it's going to get to a much paler green on the other side of that figure. But again, I'm going to work my way into the shadow side of that figure and just kind of be a little bit more careful about the bright side of her. It's okay if this goes in because I'm going to be painting her arm and her swimsuit are going to be so much darker later. Doesn't matter. All right. Get a little bit more of a turquoisey color and lighten it up a little bit on here. Even more. I'm going to paint around that left leg, leaving a little highlight. And her other leg I can kind of paint right into because that's going to be darker later anyways. Right up to the foam again here. Start kind of working that in and through some smaller brush marks. Like so. That's going to connect right up to my violet here pretty quick. Start leaving a little bit more of that breaking surf underneath her. A little bit darker again. So if I can use the white of the paper, I will, to an extent, whatever I can. I'll at least try. All right, so I've kind of established the water down by her. I want to put a little bit of warmer reflection from her skin color kind of bouncing in below her and let that fuzz a little bit. The water just feels a little bit warmer right underneath her.
So is your paper dry at this point?
Almost, yeah.
Okay.
I'm starting to get some nice hard edges here, so it's awfully close.
So the question is from the audience as to why you did not re-wet the ocean to let the blues fuzz.
I don't need to because I'm working with a big brush and kind of keep reloading my brush and connecting it. If I'm working fast enough, I don't need to re-wet my paper. I mean, that seems like a big area, but there's no need to wet that. I can just keep reloading my brush from those big puddles and fill that in, and I'm still going to get nice lost edges. But if I re-wet that, I'd have to try and avoid the foam down here and the foam up here. And so it didn't really make much sense to re-wet the whole thing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I need to finish the water up above here around this figure. Paint through her head again, just like I did with the other one. So again, this was a much smaller area up here of trying to find a connection between a couple of rocks and that little figure down below. So it was a lot more important that I came down to the bigger part of the water and make sure that that was connecting before I came up here again. So now I've got that little bit of a turquoisey color in that little area. Connect that with some more of the, so I painted this shadow of the rock, that shadow of the rock, connected this part of the rock with that part of the water, with all of this water into down here, back up here. I'm going to connect more of the shadow parts of the rock. So I'm following my kind of that game plan that I established in my value study to find connections between shapes. I don't want to lose sight of that. So easy to fall back into painting little things. And before you know it, your painting is a coloring book. And it's got no looseness and life to it. And I want it to look watery. I want those lost edges. Do some dry brush again here. Now I can leave a few little highlights on some smaller rocks along the shore here. Connect this with the water. That's this rock right here. Leaving some smaller little things down below the shore here. Some of those highlights. That's why I tinted that area before. So that when I leave light areas, I don't have white paper. I have the lighter color of the rock. Now I've got the shadow part of the rock there. Okay, we'll dry brush in a couple of spots. Same big shape. So now I'm going to come down and start. I need to darken up this wet sand and kind of spotlight my little girl here. Before I go too far, I wanted to get a little stronger, just a couple of smaller, darker blue waves in that water and kind of let them with a small, very small brush with mostly just paint. Very little water on here. This is a small synthetic brush. I just want to get a little bit of this kind of thing in my water here before it's too dry. Darker color. A bit darker right there. Knowing when you can kind of work into an area and so that you're getting a little bit of a soft edge, how much paint I have on my brush, when you have to stay out of an area because it's still too wet and you're going to have blooms or create problems. That is a big part of watercolor too. And that just takes time and practice. And even with all the time and practice, you still screw up over and over again. So watercolor is just so dependent on that timing issue of when you can come into a shape, when you have to stay out of it. So again, I wanted some of these shadows on the waves to kind of merge with what I had painted already. And this was all still hard edged up here, the edge of that big crashing wave anyway, so I didn't have to worry too much about that. But I wanted some of these shadow areas in here to be a little bit more soft edge. So before I get too far, I'm going to go ahead and put that in. But again, this is mostly just paint that I'm using on my brush right now. Very little water. If I put water on here too much, I'm going to start getting some blooms and things happening. I don't want that right now. Don't want that ever. A couple more up here at the edge of it. But now they're just kind of softly fuzzing in with a lot of what I put on there before. Start creating that little bit of an angle of the waves coming in here. Maybe darken that up right next to that figure to pop her light side a little bit better. Throw her off a little bit more. Okay, so I got a little bit of that on there. Now I'm going to continue and get this big part of the shape. And again, I don't want to get too carried away with how dark I make this. I'm going to go a little bit darker than what the reference photo was. That wet sand. I'm just using some lavender with a little burnt sienna to take the edge off. I'm going to get this wet sand coming down here. Let that start merging with the ocean up here as well. And that'll help to pop my surf a little bit better. Should probably switch to a little bigger brush. That's a big shape. Big shape, big brush. Keep reloading. Make sure I'm getting nice fluid colors here. It's nice and warm. Actually, I'm going to have to add some burnt sienna to it closer to the waves there. Can paint right through that girl's head again. Not worried about that. Right up to her back. Again, this is the point of darkening this up was so that it showed the highlight on the back of that girl a little bit better. Can go right up to her legs a little bit better this time now. Paint through that other leg there. That just kind of start, I'm going to kind of dry brush that into the rest of the sand and subtly break up that edge. And I want that to come closer to those boys like I talked about before also. Bit of a harder edge right there. Bring some of that violet into the crashing surf also. Starts to turn purple before it even gets to the beach. I'm fading that up into the beach with some dry brush. Want it to be a little warmer. Oops, not that warm. Right here. It's a little bit more brown. So it's kind of mixing all that other stuff there. Just how many times I rinse my brush and change the color on it. But it's not too long before I reload my brush. I'm constantly reloading it to make sure I have a nice wet edge to work with. Okay, again, I don't have to worry about her front arm that's sticking out and it's going to be much darker. Painting around her little bucket. Just leaving the highlights on the back of her basically. Want this wet sand to come up and just help pop this little guy a little bit better in the spot. Don't want to get too drastic with it, but didn't take extending it too much to help the painting out a little bit. Okay, I've got all that. And again, now I think I'm going to kind of switch and get some of those other darker rocks down below here. Actually, I need to finish that up above there, a little bit further up towards that other figure. Finish that crashing surf just a little bit higher up here. And I want to drop their reflections in here too. There's a little bit of a wet reflection of this other figure down in here. So if I can get this wet sand around her a little bit better. Bring that up there. Warm it up a little bit again. Reflecting on that rock a bit. Keep kind of glancing once in a while and make sure I'm not losing sight of my plan of attack here. It's real easy to do once you start looking at nothing but the reference photograph. You start painting too many little things, not the big thing. But again, that's not a hugely, earth-shattering kind of a concept, but watercolor is such a beautiful fluid medium that anytime you can find ways to let these colors mix and merge on your paper, you're really taking advantage of what sets watercolor apart from all the other mediums. Okay. And that's why I want to find that big shape and take color out of the equation on the value study. Just think in terms of value. Where's all my lights? Everything else is connected. And then when I paint it in color, I want to try and copy that shape and get some of these beautiful lost edges and color transitions on my painting. So it looks like a watercolor. Go ahead and start putting in some of these rocks down here. Go a little bit darker with things. Let those connect a bit. Why not? One more connected shape. Well, that's why I didn't really draw the rocks. I didn't have to. Wherever I paint these marks on my paper, that's where they are. Well, that's a small connection, but it's still connected. The more you break it up into all these separate little shapes, the more visually confusing things become. So if I can simplify things down as much as possible into larger connected shapes, I'm really helping things. I want to do a little bit of the darker burnt sienna work on my figures here before they're gone and kind of merge their shadow side a little bit better. Things. A couple of spots here. Again, if she fuzzes a little bit, great. She's running. I want her to fuzz. Figure out in the water here. I can go darker on her shadow side now. It's got a bit of too much of a highlight on her shoulder there. Her legs. Shadow side on that leg. And then the rest of her will be that dark swimsuit that I put in later. Figure up on the beach. She has more of a shadow side, quite a bit more. She doesn't have a whole lot of light on her. she's connected in a little bit now. I'm going to do the same thing on these little guys. I'll zoom in when I do these guys again for you so you can see a little bit better. Zoom in on the whole thing here for you. But again, this is, hopefully you can see that now. All those great color transitions that I get by working from a wet edge, that bead on my brush, trying to find connections whenever I can. Give her a little bit of a reflection down under the water here. Give this little girl a bit of a reflection down here. Just like I did on the gallon out in the water. Just dropping color in. Helps to make it look wet. Okay, I want to join my boys into this shape, even though that's very small, but got a darker leg in the back there, a darker shadow there, shadow on his belly, and his chest, shoulders, his head is quite dark. That back arm that's bent is pretty dark. Just got a little bit of a shadow on that front arm. This kid's head is mostly dark, neck, leaving that shadow or that highlight on his shoulder. His belly again is darker. His shorts are going to be quite a bit darker. But just trying to simplify and connect all the time. Get some of his dark blue swim trunks in here right now too. I can go a little bit darker on that later, but I may as well just connect it now. Tricky painting figures in the landscape. And most of my figures, it's rare that a figure in my landscape is so prominent that I have to worry about things like facial features and, you know, really getting exacting proportions. They're very gestural and small. I mean, it's still important to get the heads the right size and that kind of thing, but I like it when they have their own little individual gestures and try to make them convincing enough, but still try to paint them a matter of seconds. And not, if you take 10 minutes to paint that boy, it's going to look like you spent an hour painting that boy. It's just going to be so overworked and obtrusive. So if you can just, you know, find the important little shapes and put those on and let it be, it's amazing what you can get away with, and the viewer sees, you know, sees what you want them to see without getting too carried away with things. I'm going to darken up the shadows a little bit and connect them. And then I should have that big middle value shape. How am I doing on time here? Well, okay, I hope. Try to speed things up, give him a little bit of a cast shadow there. I can darken up his hair just a little bit. Now I can do that later too, but making sure those shadows are connecting. The front of his shorts were a little bit darker. Okay, so the figures are connected. I got some nice color transitions in the sand. The rocks are bleeding into the water where places where I want them to. I still have the darks on these rocks that I haven't put in yet to make even more separations. And I don't want to lose all the connections. So I'm going to try and preserve, you know, some of those nice lost edges that I tried to find. But now's the time to add a lot more detail and kind of make things pop if you need to. And like I said, I can even come in with gouache and stuff later and put a little bit more of that in if I needed to. But for now, all the big things are done. And it's basically like an hour into the painting. And I've got the guts of it in there. It's reading fine.
Question about your brushes that you're using.
Yep. So this, I kind of range from when I start my painting. These are these nice big silver black velvet brushes. Silver is the brand that makes them, and black velvet is the line. And it's kind of a blend of synthetic and squirrel. So it's a little bit cheaper in that regard, but they're great brushes. They last, they hold a lot of paint and water. You can get a big, you know, this is I don't know if you can see it on there. It's MD is the size. They have, I think it's just MD and LG for like large or whatever. People always ask me, what number brush is that? Every manufacturer uses a different number system, so it doesn't really matter that much. But this MD Squirrel Mop by Silver Black Velvet is really a nice one for knocking in those light washes. And then I start transitioning to more of like the sable type brushes, like a size 14 or 16. And you can get, you know, Cheap Joe's again has those great pseudo sable brushes, and the dragon's tongue or whatever they call it, and so they're affordable, and they're still, or you can go all out and spend a lot and actually get big sable brushes, but they're quite expensive. But these hold enough paint and water, but yet they have a bit better point than the big squirrel mops. So I use that for that big middle value connected shape because they hold a lot of paint and water. I can paint that big shape of the water without re-wetting my paper. I just keep reloading that brush a lot, but it's got a nice point on it, so I can still kind of cut around some of these smaller things. When I was painting these little tendrils and the waves and things, I didn't switch to a smaller brush. I was just still using this big brush. Okay. So I use that for my middle value. Then when I get to the smaller ones, the darks and things, then I switch to like the Escoda Perla. This is a little Da Vinci synthetic brush. This is just this might be another Escoda Perla too. It's really old and beat up. It's a tiny little one that I use for, little shapes for figures. But I switched to synthetic brushes for my darks and details because I don't want it to hold a lot of water. I'm painting smaller shapes, so that's when I switched to those. And I had this synthetic brush when I was putting in these little darker things because, again, I didn't want to have too much water on my brush and make blooms. So when I was putting in those, it was mostly just paint, and I used that little Da Vinci synthetic brush for putting those shapes in. Okay.
Thank
Um, uh, Liz, I will put a link to the materials page for the workshops in the chat in just a second.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Okay. So if you compare that shape to the shape on my value study and kind of look back and forth, awfully close, right? It was so important to have that map. This is way too much to paint, way too much information in there. If I just draw this out and start diving in and start painting that straight off of that reference photo, I'm going to get lost. Okay. By taking the, whatever it was, 10, 15 minutes to sketch that out quickly first and just break that out into those two initial big shapes, leave the white paper for my light wash, and then everything else, if I can find a way to simplify and connect. And I'm practicing painting the shape of the waves because I paint my value studies instead of using markers or something. That's also beneficial. I've warmed up a little bit better with a brush in my hand and paint and water. But then I'm just kind of keeping these right next to each other when I'm doing my painting and making sure I'm just every once in a while keep glancing up here so I don't lose. It's so easy to just get sucked into this and start rendering and painting that photograph before you need to. That's not that the darks aren't important, as you'll see now. Hopefully they'll add quite a bit to this scene, the implied detail and things, and just add some life. But you want those darks to be accents and not rely on them to hold the painting together. This is what holds the painting together, the big middle value shape. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and just going to let that dry a bit and go back to my value study and just try and find a few of those all-important darks here now. So I'm just back to Payne's Gray again now. Small synthetic brush. And I'll practice painting my little figures and dry brushing on the rocks and whatever I need to do here. So this lady has a lot more of a shadow on that side of her head. She's got the crisscross swimsuit. And the bottom of the swimsuit is quite dark also. And a little bit even coming down onto that leg and her arm. That shadow side of her arm is pretty dark also. And she's got a little bit of a shadow being cast onto the water here to the right. Underneath her, maybe a little bit of a reflection or two. All right, so she's in there, this little girl, quite a bit darker on her head also. And the front of her, that other arm is dark on top of everything. The front of her swimsuit, that back leg is quite dark. The shadow side of their front leg is there. Guess I could have zoomed in a little bit more for you, sorry. And same thing, kind of give her a little bit of a shadow going up the beach. So that helps to define her a little bit better. There's a couple of small little darks at the front end of this crashing wave here too. Give that some form. A little bit of a shadow in a couple of parts. Make it a little bit more three-dimensional. Okay, the little guys over here. I can go even darker, maybe on his belly and that back arm. His head is quite dark. I did a little bit of this already on my color version, but not that much. I'm probably gonna have to darken up those guys quite a bit later. I'm just finding some opportunities for refinement on these guys too. Darken up that back arm. Get a little cast shadow going back. This lady's hair is a little bit darker. The back of hers in shadow. Her swimsuit. A little bit on the back of her leg. Her little shadow going up too. Just nice and simple. And I already did some of this stuff again on my color painting too, some of these waves, but I might have to go ahead and dry brush some in on my color version as well. So I've got that in. We've got some shadow sides on these rocks down below here. I want to show a little bit of that too. Kind of separate those out. And on these guys, even though I connected them, give them a little bit of form. Shadow like so. All right, now onto the big boys. Quite a bit darker on the shadow side of this guy. Coming down to the water, start doing some dry brushing. A little bit of a reflection coming down. Shadow, just like the people, the rocks are also casting some shadows going on the other direction. This dark shadow on this rock is going to help pop the highlight on the other rock right next to it. Again, using a dark shape to show a lighter shape. Watercolor is the only medium where you don't paint your light shapes. It's the only transparent medium. All the other media, acrylic, even the gouache, are opaque. You can paint light shapes, the positive shape. All our light shapes are created by painting darker shapes around them. Okay, so you've got to plan ahead for that kind of thing too. Just use that to your advantage. Okay, now I've got the edge of that big rock area up here. That's quite dark. Around some of these smaller ones along the shore. Dry brush showing some of these forms, bigger forms of the shadows coming down on these rocks. Again, kind of changing the direction of my brush stroke, dry brush them once in a while. Get a few other smaller shadow shapes on these closer rocks down below. Just practicing. But again, if I did this with a marker and then go and try and paint them, it's the first time I'm painting all these shadows and creating these shapes is on my actual painting. Now by doing this on a value study that I painted using a brush and paint and water, it's a lot more, it translates just so much better onto my actual painting. Warmed up and practiced all these things. We got this big flat rock here, the front end of it, little one there, and that's kind of casting a shadow towards her, some other little waves and things, whatever. All right, but that kind of, I mean, that obviously adds quite a bit to the scene. But again, and it's that old question also, when is enough enough? Okay, I don't want to paint every tiny little dark shape in here. Find the big important ones, practice painting a few other smaller little rocks and see what it does. Sometimes you go too far and it's like, oops, I didn't need that. Don't remind myself, don't do that on my painting, so that's important too, to kind of work through some of those issues. All right, that's reading pretty well now. That adds a lot to it with no color or anything. If you showed that black and white thing to the value study to someone and asked them what they saw, hopefully 95 out of 100 people will say a beach scene. A couple of random oddballs might say people in traffic or whatever, but for the most part, you've got people convinced. All right. So then everything else is bonus, on the color version, what you can get away with. I've already got the color of the sand, all this going for me on here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit again so you can see them all together. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing now. I'll just go ahead and start up on the rocks, and then I'll zoom in on my people when I do that for you so you can see it a little better. I want to get those nice warm rock shadows in this synthetic brush. Now, my value study is not a black and white painting, okay? It's vastly oversimplified. I want it to be that way. I try and keep those, really purposefully kind of down and dirty. I don't want to get too carried away with how much I put in my value studies. It's just to kind of show myself the big plan of attack. So my color painting is, yes, it's a little bit more involved. When I'm putting in some of these shapes, a little bit more dry brush, I'll take a little bit more care on some of the shapes, but I'm still trying to maintain some of that nice looseness from the value study and the freshness. I want my paintings to look like a painting, not like a rendering. So the more I can leave to the viewer's imagination, once I've got the big shapes in, like I was just saying, I've got most people convinced what it is they're seeing. I don't need to keep working and beating this thing to death. I just can stop and let them have some fun and interpret some of the small things for themselves. So you'll find that even more down there. Okay, this big dark shape on that rock, and that's going to help pop the highlight on my closer rock. Paint right up to that. Now I've got some real nice light on those rocks. A little bit more dry brush. Gonna bring some of that color down here and let it reflect into the water a bit, into these waves. I'm mixing, for the most part, Payne's Gray, Burnt Sienna, and Raw Sienna for the color of the shadow on these rocks here now. Okay, get this big shadow area. Probably looks a little too dark on your screen. It's not black. It's got some color in it. Paint around the top of that one that's overlapping there. I talked about this in the workshop too. I get asked that question a lot. Why did you choose watercolor? When people are interviewing me for podcasts and stuff, why watercolor? And I tell them it just kind of suits my temperament. I like to, when I'm excited about a scene, I want to paint it, and it's usually done in a few hours at most. And tomorrow I'm on to something else that piques my interest, and I'm starting a new painting. I don't have any desire to go down to my studio for 7-8 days in a row and be staring at the same painting day after day after day and keep working on it. I don't know what I'm going to want to paint tomorrow. So I just kind of wait and see what excites me. Sometimes I don't feel like painting at all, but this way, this kind of style that loosely impressionistic, but still has enough, it's still based in realism. I want it to look like the scene. But I don't want to get so carried away with things and labored over it that, like I said, I'm coming down and walking out of my studio day after day and seeing the same painting. That's just boring to me. Or nice shadows up there. Fun with rock shadows. And you can see I'm kind of always changing the direction of my brush, pushing it to kind of show the form. When it's flat at the base of the water, I'm making a flat brush stroke. Sometimes I'm pulling the brush up. If I'm kind of doing a dry brush stroke to show the form on the rocks, I'll make sure my brush is going in that direction. But I very rarely paint with the tip of a brush. I'm always painting with the side of it, painting shapes. That's really important. I have to use the tip once in a while if I'm really careful about, cutting around a small shape or something. But for the most part, I'm using the side of my brush and really just painting descriptive shapes, not outlining when it comes time to put my darks in. I don't want to outline shapes to get them back. Got this rock down here. It's got a little bit of a shadow on it on the shore. And again, this is just a ref. Nobody has any idea where those rocks were, how many they were. You know, I don't have to get too literal with the reference photograph here. I'm just trying to use it as a general reference here and creating these shapes. But if I can get a few of these rocks painted a little bit more convincingly, and then I can just do some dry brush when I get closer to the edges and finish them off. But that really, that adds a lot, putting those shadows on the rocks. I didn't have to worry about that 25 minutes ago. I was worried about painting the colors or what I'm going to see underneath these rocks when I paint around on these shadow shapes and leave something behind. Kind of break this up now and be a little bit more random with things and dry brushing.
So there's a question as to how much are you referring to your value study versus the reference photo when you're adding the darks?
Most of the time it's just kind of, at this point now it's informing. I look at it, I'm like, okay, what do I have to do next? Once I've worked through the rocks, right now I'm kind of looking at the rocks while I'm painting all this stuff on the reference photograph. But then after I'm done with these rocks, I'll look back and say, okay, now what do I need to do? And go to the figure. So it's still informing, what I'm trying to accomplish and kind of keeping me on track. But yeah, while I'm painting these shapes now, I'm mostly looking at the actual reference photograph. Okay, so I've got some nice descriptive rock shapes up there. I want to do a little bit of a couple of warmer dry brush strokes just to add something up here in a couple of spots. Break it up just a little bit in these lighter areas. So they're not too dead. In here. Rock up this a little bit too. All right. That was fun. Now I'm going to do the darks on my figures. I'll try and zoom in a little bit for you again here so you can see that I'm doing them. Okay, so I'm going to get this gal out and standing in the water. Right. Sorry if I'm sticking my head in here. I got to see a little bit. Okay, here's that dark side of her hair. Darken up the shadow side of her torso a bit more. Quite dark over here. It's pretty dramatic. Much darker that was. Getting a little highlight there. That other leg was pretty dark at the top of it here. And then a little bit of a highlight down below. That leg had some more of a shadow coming down like that, kind of connecting to the bottom of the water. And then a little bit kind of a deeper blue for her swimsuit. Okay, so she's in there. She's casting a little bit of a shadow across the water. Need to get that in. Make sure it's not just straight across, it's following the little waves. A little bit underneath her too. Okay, a little reflection there, just like on my value study, a little bit at the edge of the waves now. The front edge of the waves in a couple of spots have a bit more form to them. Give them some volume. And then here it's more merging with the water. Here it's got a little bit of a front edge again. Down here, maybe just a little bit of a front edge or two. Just in a couple spots, but that's helps too. All the, you can see that on there, right? I hope a little bit of a darker front edge of the shadow shape on the wave, but it's not the whole thing. Again, I don't want to outline and lose some of the lost edges. There's a reason why I have some of those passages. I want to leave some of that behind. So don't overdo it and overfill things. Keep some of that nice softness and looseness behind. All right, darken up my little girl in the front here. There. More of just kind of a burnt sienna again for her skin tone. Face there, the front edge of her. Keep that highlight there. Her back arm is quite a bit darker. I'll have to do that. That front leg is darker. A little bit unfinished to help make it look like she's running up to the boys there. The water, holding her bucket. She's got that darker hand coming up like this. And she's casting a little shadow onto the water.
So what mix of paints do you use for the shadows is a question just posed.
I've just added some lavender and all this stuff that's on my palette, so it doesn't really have a color to it. I just didn't want it to be too black is all. I'm trying to make it, I added some lavender to it because it's on top of that lavender water. I literally just kind of mixed it with all that gray stuff that was in the corner also, so it's not a really clean color by any means. Okay, so her little form is in there. The little figure standing up here. Darken up her hair quite a bit. Her swimsuit coming down, kind of showing where her arm was. Back of her arm. And I'm going to give her a shadow also up onto the beach. Tie her down to the scene. The little guys playing in the sand. It's fun. I just, again, I love painting in watercolor. I don't really have a favorite type of a scene. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, so I love painting farms and things, but I get excited about all different types of scenes. It's just a lot of fun things to paint. Sometimes it's just very subtle mist, over the landscape. Sometimes it's a moon over the snow. Sometimes it's something like this. It's a lot more active and vibrant and sunny, and you've got a lot of fun shapes to paint and bigger edges, but I get a kick out of all of it. And darken up his feet there. That back leg was quite a bit darker. Knee, darken up this kid's face a bit more. Quite a bit more shadow on from his face onto his shoulder. Get that his darker hand there, darken up down there. Just a few little shapes. Again, they're also, even though they're a lot more stationary than the girl running up onto the beach, they're still moving and doing something. So don't have to get too stiff with their shapes. Okay, give them the little shadow. Again, darken some of that up a little bit better than I had before in a couple of spots. So they're really singing. I mean, that was kind of important to put that sand over his back to help highlight the arch of his back there before, and again, that's when I start thinking solely in terms of value. Those are the decisions that you start making when you're planning your painting. How am I going to show off that light shape? I need a little darker shape next to it. Okay. So it's such an important thing. Color, I love color. It's I hopefully I have a lot of color in my paintings. I keep going for that, but it's all based on understanding the values first and foremost.
I have another question from another member. Previously, you said that the shadow color was raw sienna, burnt sienna, and Payne's gray.
Uh-huh. That was for the rocks.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Depends on what, yeah, there's not a standard color for shadows. Depends on what it's on. The rocks were warmer brown, so I used raw sienna, burnt sienna, and Payne's gray to have those warm shadows. This was on a cooler, that lavender part of the beach. So I had some lavender and blue in the shadow. Okay. So you can't just look for a formula and say, this is the color that shadows are. That's not the way it works. It depends. The shadows are semi-transparent dark where you're seeing the local color underneath it. Okay, I'm going to zoom out again and put in just a few last details. But once I zoom out, you can see, I mean, most of that scene is in there now. It's got the nice loose start to it, a lot of fluidity, all the big shapes are in there. Now I need to do some work on the beach with some of the shadows on the rocks, some little rocks, some flotsam and jetsam and all that kind of junk. But that's all small stuff. That's just going to kind of wrap things up. Now we've got these kind of blue rocks down here. I want to give them a kind of a shadow side on that. I'm going to darken up the rock itself just a little bit more over the top of that violety color. I want to see that shape a little bit better here. Not quite that dark. Okay, so I did kind of like that nice big rock there. The edge of the water, so I can put that in. A little darken up maybe a little bit more of this one too before I put the shadows in. Just to jazz it up a little bit more. Okay, some little guys up on the shore here on the beach, little rocks. Small little details. Give the rock, give it a shadow. And if it has any height to it at all, you want to make sure it's got a little cast shadow to it, just like everything else does. Some of these little guys aren't going to be casting shadows, so I don't have to worry about that. Some quick dry brush strokes once in a while to break that beach up. It's a little bit too plain and open. That little ledge there. I want some more sand here that they're working on. Kind of disturbing all this little area. They're building their castle. Make that sand look a little bit more disturbed with some footprints and things. They had to get down there somehow, right? Footprints in the sand. That little girl probably running back and forth, creating her own little footprints back up there. But again, this can become danger time. All of a sudden you're just picking away, and as soon as you find yourself putting stuff in just for the sake of moving your brush around, it's probably a good time to stop and evaluate. There's a few little areas that I wanted, like I said, it was just too empty up there in the sand. I needed to do some dry brush and texture things to break it up a bit, but got to be careful. Don't want to get too perfect with things. Darken up her reflection just a little bit better there. A little bit more warmth in the water there. I'm going to put a little bit of the blue up above in that top left corner, and then I'll pull out some gouache and just put a couple little tendrils at the front end of that crashing wave. And I will let you enjoy the rest of your evening. This is just a little too white. Same thing, I kind of want the front edge of that curling wave, just like I did along the shore, to have just a little bit of value and color to it. So it's not just white. So this front end of this wave, as it's crashing, I want to make sure it's got some form to it here. And then breaking out into here a bit more. But this was small stuff. Again, I didn't want to stop what I was doing down here. Much more important, bigger connections, to start fiddling around up here earlier. I can always come back up here and do some of these little darker shapes and not really connected to anything. So that helps break that wave up a little bit better. It was just a little bit too plain and white before. Okay, I'm going to pull out that tiny little brush and my tube of gouache. I'll zoom in a bit for you while I do this too. On the water, the front edge of the water.
Are you using Jaune Brilliant or white?
White gouache. Yeah, just white gouache. Whoops. And I just take this little synthetic brush, get it damp, and I stick it right into the tube of gouache. And I just want to get a little bit more of this foam action. Again, I painted around what I could, but I didn't get it all. And it's not all the white of the paper either. If I thin out this gouache a little bit, it'll dry a little semi-transparent and it won't be white, okay? So it'll be slightly lighter foam, but it's not quite the white of the paper, and that's a good thing too. Just for some of these other smaller waves as they're breaking in and out of here. On the front edge.
Well, I want to make a comment, and that is that your painting looks better than the photo.
Well, that's a good comment. Thank you, and I appreciate it. And that's always the goal, right? I don't
Right.
want, and that's another thing. I'm glad you mentioned that I talk about in a lot of my workshops with students. And some of the longer workshops, the 5-day workshop, the 5th day, I let students work from their own reference photograph. The shorter ones, I usually don't. We just work off of scenes that I bring along with me, just stuck my arm in my tube of gouache. And then students bring all these reference photographs and they ask me for my advice on choosing a photo. And way too often I'm like, getting rid of 80% of them. It's just way too much. And I fell into the same trap when I first started to paint. I was always looking for something amazing to paint the subject, and even now, I mean, I've been painting for 30 years and it's still difficult to paint things that I call them calendar photos. There's a lot of photos that I take that without any intent to paint. Okay. Because in a way, especially when you're learning and you haven't developed all the skills yet, you're setting yourself for constant disappointment. You're going to try and paint that beautiful reference photograph and you're going to compare it to your painting and you're going to be always like, I didn't get it. I didn't paint it as nice as the photo is. Why set yourself up for that disappointment? I paint a lot more everyday scenes now, but I try and treat them in a painterly manner like this, and nice and loose and fresh, so that hopefully more often than not, people will, and I appreciate again the comment, that people will say, I like your painting better than the photo, and not vice versa, where they're looking at it and saying, well, you came close. Better luck next time. So I hope that makes sense, but it's so true. And like I said, I fell into that same trap when I was learning how to paint. I was always trying to find something really gorgeous to tackle, and I just wasn't capable of doing it. And now maybe I'm a little more capable, but now I'm just not interested. I don't really, if something's that pretty and I can't improve on it, I don't feel any need to paint it. So
But
Okay.
once again, Andy, you make it look too easy.
No, and again, it's not easy. I've been painting for 30 years and teaching for 20 of those years. And but hopefully, you know, through all these demos and things, again, I'm just trying to impart upon you the importance of finding the big shapes, loosen up a little bit, don't sweat the small stuff, you know, let the viewer find, you know, some of those small things, and leaving something to the viewer's imagination is huge. Okay. You want some room for interpretation, and that's a very fine line to walk, the line between a painting and a rendering. Okay. This would turn into a rendering if I spent another hour on this, putting everything that I see in here into here. I don't want it to be I want it to be a painting. So if all the big shapes are in there, I've got the impression that I wanted, the colors, the looseness, and let the viewer decide the rest. All
So I
right.
have a question. Do you ever compile two different images into one? Do you take like different reference photos and then maybe combine them, or use stuff from one image and some from another image to make a painting?
Very rarely. About the only thing I'll do is, you know, maybe if I've got a landscape that I really like and it could use a horse or a grazing or something, I might do that, or add another person. But you've got to be really careful about doing that and make sure that the direction of light is the same, you know, all that kind of stuff, so that you don't have two suns all of a sudden, and, you know, shadows are going multiple directions and everything. So more often than not, that's the kind of thing that I'm doing. Is just, but most of the time what I'm actually doing is taking things out of it to make it easier to paint, instead of adding things in and combining multiple photos.
Okay, that makes sense.
Andy, if you can take a photo of your finished painting and also send me your reference again, we'll put those in the video.
Sure. Yep. I'll do that for you.
Great.
Thank you, Andy.
My pleasure. Thanks again.
Wonderful.
I appreciate you adjusting your schedule for the meeting and doing it a little earlier. Hope everybody had fun.
It was awesome.
Good. Yeah, maybe one of these days I can actually make it out there to teach in person. That'd be fun too.
We're definitely going to work on that.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Andy.
Yep.
Andy.
Good night, all.